A flight attendant told the woman in seat 3A that economy was in the back, even though her ticket said first class. 40 minutes later, an Air Force pilot walked onto that plane and stopped dead in his tracks. The gray hoodie had seen better decades. Faded almost white at the seams, a small burn mark on the left cuff that never quite came out no matter how many times she washed it. Meredith Colt pulled it tighter around her shoulders as she stood in line at Gate C-14, Portland International, boarding pass folded into a small rectangle in her palm. She didn't look like someone who belonged in seat 3A, she knew that. She'd bought the ticket herself, paid full fare in cash 6 weeks ago because it was the only seat left on the only direct flight to Richmond that would get her to her father's bedside before the surgery. She hadn't packed for appearances, she'd packed for grief. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step to the side for a moment." The gate agent, a young man with a name tag that read Tyler, was polite enough, but his eyes did the thing people's eyes did when they saw her, a quick top-to-bottom sweep, jeans torn at the knee from wear and not from fashion, canvas sneakers gone soft at the soles, an old olive-drab backpack slung over one shoulder with a faded unit patch stitched near the strap. He scanned her boarding pass twice like the machine had made a mistake. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Just this says first class. I need to verify." "It's real," she said, and waited. It came back real, because it was. She boarded early, found 3A by the window, and folded herself into it without ceremony. She didn't check her reflection in the little compact mirror some women pulled out before takeoff. She didn't order champagne. She set the backpack under the seat in front of her, tucked her hands in her lap, and looked out at the tarmac like she was waiting for something else entirely. That was when Vivian Cross found her. Vivian was the lead flight attendant on Meridian Air Flight 1187, 22 years with the airline, a woman who wore her seniority like a rank insignia. She glanced at the seating chart, then at Meredith, then back at the chart, like the two didn't reconcile. "Ma'am, I think there's been some confusion. Economy's in the back. The flight's completely full today, so you'll just need to sit back there." A businessman 2 rows up, silver watch, cufflinks that caught the cabin light, let out a short laugh without looking up from his phone. A woman across the aisle smiled, the particular smile of someone enjoying a show. "I'm in the right seat," Meredith said quietly, and held up her boarding pass. Vivian studied it a beat too long, jaw tightening, before handing it back without apology. "Of course. My mistake." She said it in a tone that made clear she didn't believe it was a mistake at all. She believed the airline had made an error somewhere upstream, and Meredith was the beneficiary of it. What Vivian didn't know, what no one on that aircraft knew, was that the error had a paper trail. 6 weeks earlier, when a cash payment for seat 3A had pinged the reservation system, a flag had quietly attached itself to the file. Not a fraud flag. Not a security flag. A name match flag, routed not through the airline, but through a government contracts compliance office 2 states away, where someone with clearance they weren't supposed to have had seen the name Colt, Meredith cross a list she should never have crossed, and made a call asking, casually, unofficially, whether that passenger might be encouraged toward a later flight. Nothing illegal, nothing that would show up in writing. Just a soft, deniable nudge, the kind powerful people learn to make, so that if anyone ever asked, there'd be nothing to find. Meredith said nothing. She wasn't here to argue a boarding pass. She was here to get to Richmond, and this was just the first 40 minutes of a day she intended to survive quietly. The man who took the seat beside her introduced himself as Grant Halsey, mid-40s, pinstripe suit, the confident ease of someone who'd flown first class so many times, it had stopped registering as a privilege. He gave her the same once-over Vivian had, lingering half a second on the frayed cuffs, then went back to his tablet. "Business trip?" he asked, not really asking. "Something like that," Meredith said. He didn't ask again. Behind them, a young woman named Paisley Renner, early 20s, oversized sunglasses, pushed up into glossy hair, the kind of Instagram polish that took real money to look effortless, leaned over the seat back with a saccharine smile. "Oh my gosh, you must be so excited to be up here," Paisley said, loud enough for the row to hear. "Like this is a big deal for you, huh?" A ripple of laughter moved through the cabin like a current. "It's just a flight," Meredith said, and turned to the window. Her hand found the water bottle in the seat pocket and gripped it hard enough to leave a crease in the plastic, the only sign that any of it landed. Once they reached cruising altitude, Vivian came through with the premium meal service seared salmon, a small charcuterie board, warm rolls under a linen napkin. She skipped Meredith's row entirely, then circled back with a practiced, saccharine apology. "I'm so sorry, we only have enough of the premium option for our—" She paused, glancing at the manifest. "Our regular first-class guests today." A man 2 rows up, Grady Ellison, tie already loosened, though they were barely an hour into the flight, chuckled into his scotch. "Don't worry about it. She's probably used to a drive-through anyway." The cabin laughed again, that same easy, cruel little laugh that costs the people making it nothing and the person absorbing it everything. "Water's fine," Meredith said, flat. Unbothered on the surface, the way she'd learned to keep her voice level in rooms far worse than this one. Grant Halsey leaned toward her later, conversational, like he was doing her a favor by talking to her at all. "You look like you're headed to a job interview. Hope you've got something better than that hoodie in the bag." "I'm good," she said, and didn't elaborate. She'd learned a long time ago that explaining yourself to people who've already decided who you are is a losing game. You either let them find out the truth on their own terms, or you spend your whole life running a defense that nobody asked to hear. Halsey's own phone buzzed against his knee just then, a name from his firm's compliance division lighting the screen. He silenced it without looking, the reflexive habit of a man who spent his life not looking too closely at the calls he took. 40 minutes from Richmond, the pilot's voice came over the intercom, apologetic and clipped, due to a mechanical advisory light. The flight would be making an unscheduled stop at Joint Base Langley Eustis for a precautionary inspection and refuel. Groans rolled through the cabin. Someone muttered about missing a connection. Grant Halsey sighed theatrically like the delay was a personal insult. Meredith didn't react. She'd sat through worse delays in far worse aircraft. As the plane began its descent, a businessman retrieving something from the overhead bin muttered to the row in general. "Some people really don't know their place, do they?" His eyes flicking, not quite subtly, toward Meredith. She looked up at him. "I know exactly where I am," she said, quiet. Even but something in it made him sit back down without another word, his ears going red. Grady Ellison, emboldened by his second scotch, leaned across the aisle with a smirk. "What, you want to fly the plane too?" "I've worked near planes before," Meredith said, and went back to looking out the window. His grin faltered, though he couldn't have said exactly why. The wheels touched down on the long military runway at Langley with a soft double thump, and the plane taxied toward a service apron lined with hangars and a row of sleek gray fighters, their canopies catching the afternoon sun. Vivian's voice came over the intercom, honeyed and official. "Ladies and gentlemen, while we complete our inspection, a few of our premium guests have been invited onto the tarmac to meet some of the Air Force pilots stationed here. Please remain seated unless personally notified." Her eyes swept the cabin and landed, briefly, pointedly, on Meredith, a look that said clearly enough who wasn't on that list. 2 rows back, Marlo Weston, a travel influencer with a phone permanently attached to her hand, murmured to her seatmate, Rosalind Doyle, "They're probably not going to want pictures with someone dressed like that near the jets." A woman in a camel-colored coat leaned toward Vivian as she passed, voice pitched to Carrie. "Honestly, you'd think they'd screen people better for a flight like this." "Screening's not really my department," Meredith said quietly, without turning her head, and the woman froze mid-sip of her sparkling water, unsure if she'd actually been addressed or just imagined it. It was around then that Grant Halsey, rattled by the unscheduled stop and eager to look useful in front of a cabin that had started to feel strange to him, took the call he'd silenced earlier. He kept his voice low, but not low enough. "Yeah, I know it's her, I know. We flagged it weeks ago. I don't know why she's still on the plane. That was supposed to be handled before Portland. He caught Vivian's eyes on him and stopped cold, forced a smile, ended the call. Vivian frowned, filing the strange half-sentence away without understanding it, the way you file away a word in a language you don't speak. Then the cabin door opened, and a man in a flight suit stepped through it, tall, close-cropped hair, going gray at the temples, silver oak leaves on his collar. Major Silas Bennett, squadron commander. He moved down the aisle with the easy authority of someone used to being saluted, shaking a hand here, exchanging a pleasantry there. Then his eyes reached row 3, and he stopped walking. He stared at Meredith for a long second, like a man trying to convince himself he wasn't seeing a ghost. "Are you—" he started, then straightened, his voice dropping into something almost reverent. "Ma'am, are you Shadowhawk 12? The cabin went very quiet. Meredith looked up at him, and for the first time since Portland, something shifted behind her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or the particular fatigue of a person who has spent years hoping nobody would ask that question and being ready anyway when they finally did. She gave a small nod. Grant Halsey let out a short, disbelieving scoff, the kind of sound a man makes when the joke he's about to tell suddenly doesn't feel safe anymore. Bennett's jaw tightened, and he turned to him with a look that could have stripped paint. "My apologies, ma'am, for having you sit back here through all this," he said, loud now, deliberately loud, loud enough for every row in the cabin to hear. "You're invited onto the tarmac immediately. It would be our honor." As she rose and gathered her backpack, a man in a navy suit 2 rows up scoffed under his breath. "This has to be some kind of mix-up. She doesn't look like anyone important." Meredith paused in the aisle, turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. "Looks can be deceiving," she said, and kept walking. Outside, the Virginia heat hit like a wall, jet fuel, and cut grass, and the low thrum of idle engines. A full flight line of F-22 Raptor pilots stood at attention in a straight formation on the tarmac, helmets under their arms, sunlight glinting off polished flight suits. Major Bennett's voice cut through the wind, carrying across the apron. "Attention on the flight line. This is Midnight Viper, the officer who once led 3 squadrons through hostile airspace and brought every one of them home." 20 hands snapped up in salute, sharp and simultaneous, the kind of unified motion that only comes from people who mean it. Meredith stood a little straighter. She raised her hand and returned the salute, slow and steady, and something in her shoulders, some old, carried weight, finally eased, just slightly, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. Back on the plane, disbelief moved through the cabin faster than the story itself. "It's probably some kind of honorary thing," Vivian offered to another attendant, not quite convinced by her own words. "A goodwill gesture. Publicity. Sounds like something out of a movie," Grant Halsey muttered, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty and something else had crept into it now, something closer to fear. Because if the woman in seat 3A was who that officer said she was, then the call he'd just made, the flag his firm's government contracts division had quietly placed on her name weeks ago, was no longer a piece of corporate housekeeping he could bury in a compliance folder. It was a problem with a face. And that face had just been saluted by 20 Air Force pilots on an active runway. He didn't say any of that out loud. He didn't have to. Vivian noticed him go pale and reach for his phone again, thumb hovering, before he put it face down on his tray table like it had burned him. Then a young Air Force officer climbed the aircraft stairs carrying a battered flight helmet, its surface scuffed from wear, a name stenciled across the side in fading block letters, Midnight Viper. Major Bennett explained, for the benefit of the now silent cabin, that the call sign and the helmet were awarded to exactly one pilot in the squadron's history, the survivor and architect of a classified operation that, even now, most of the men on that tarmac only knew in fragments and rumor. Meredith took the helmet in both hands. She turned it over once, like greeting an old friend, then settled it onto her head. It fit like it had never left. A young pilot stepped up the stairs behind Bennett, cap in hand. "Ma'am, you're the one who saved my squadron 2 tours ago. I wasn't even supposed to know it was you. I just knew someone got us out." Another pilot, barely out of his 20s, held out a battered green logbook, its pages soft with handling. "Ma'am, you signed this for me 3 years ago. I didn't think I'd ever see you again to say thank you properly." Meredith took it, traced her thumb across the old signature, and smiled small, real, tired, in the way that only comes from carrying something heavy for a long time. "You made it through," she said simply, and handed it back. A junior flight attendant, barely into her 20s herself, approached with a small silver eagle pin cupped in her palm, hands trembling slightly. "This is from the crew," she said. "For your service." "We didn't know. I'm sorry we didn't know." Meredith took it without a word and pinned it carefully to the strap of her backpack, beside the faded old patch that had been there for years. As the plane taxied back toward the runway, 2 F-22s pulled into formation alongside the fuselage, close enough that passengers pressed against the windows could see the pilots' helmets turned toward the cabin. Major Bennett's voice crackled through a headset that had been placed almost ceremonially on Meredith's seatback tray. "Midnight Viper, this is Eagle 1. We never got the chance to properly thank you for what you did for us." "It's an honor to fly beside you again, ma'am." Meredith lifted the headset to her ear. "Hold formation, Eagle 1, she said, her voice calm, certain, unmistakably a voice used to being obeyed. "Yes, ma'am," came the immediate, unified reply. The cabin went dead silent. Grant Halsey sat frozen, his drink halfway to his mouth, ice slowly melting, forgotten. His earlier phone call sitting in the quiet cabin air like a confession no one had fully understood yet except Vivian, who was starting to piece it together, glancing at him now with something colder than confusion. Marla Weston stared at her phone screen without seeing it. Vivian's hands fumbled with an empty tray she'd been holding for nearly a full minute, unsure what to do with either the tray or her face. One of the passengers who'd laughed loudest earlier in the flight rose unsteadily from his seat and made his way up the aisle, red to the ears. I didn't know who you were," he said. "I'm sorry. Truly. For what I said back there." Meredith looked at him for a long moment, nodded once, and turned back to the window without another word. She didn't need the apology. She'd stopped needing those a long time ago. She had earned that call sign and that helmet at 19 years old on a mission so deeply classified that even the men and women who'd flown beside her never learned its full shape. She had brought every single one of them home. That was the only part of the story that had ever mattered to her. Richmond International was warm with early evening light when the plane finally landed. At the gate, a tall man stood a little apart from the crowd, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the jet bridge with the quiet patience of someone who had waited for her at a lot of gates over a lot of years. Julian Colt didn't wave or call out. He just waited, the way he always did, until she was close enough to fold into him without a word. A little girl nearby tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing. "Is that the pilot lady? The one everybody was talking about on the plane?" Her mother, who'd heard the whispers rippling back through the jet bridge line, nodded. "That's her baby." Meredith caught the exchange and gave the girl a small, warm smile before Julian took the flight helmet from under her arm so she wouldn't have to carry it another step. The fallout arrived quietly, the way these things do now, not through official channels, but through a stranger's phone video that made its way online before the plane had even finished taxiing to the gate. Grant Halsey was identified by name within 18 hours, and by then the video wasn't the only thing working against him. A junior compliance officer at his firm, watching the same clip everyone else was watching, connected it to an email chain from 6 weeks earlier, one flagging a cash-purchased first-class ticket under the name Colt, Meredith for additional verification, originating from someone in the company's government contracts division who'd apparently had eyes on a personnel list they had no business seeing. Nobody ever fully explained, at least not publicly, why a mid-level defense contractor would want a decorated, classified operative quietly bumped off a commercial flight. But the firm, a company with active government clients who took a distinctly dim view both of executives mocking veterans on camera and of employees improperly accessing classified personnel data, didn't wait to find out. Halsey was terminated the following morning, and by the end of the week, 2 federal offices were reportedly asking his former employer some very pointed questions about who exactly had pulled that list and why. Marlo Weston lost her sponsorship deal by that evening, her follower count cratering as the clip made its rounds, with her voice clearly audible in it. Vivian Cross received a formal written reprimand from Meridian Air and was reassigned to short regional routes, her decades of seniority no longer enough to shield her from a viral 80 seconds. Paisley Renner's employer issued a brief statement distancing itself from her. Grady Ellison was quietly dropped as a consultant by 2 of his firm's biggest clients within the week. Meredith never watched any of it unfold. She didn't search her name. She didn't check the video. She didn't need to know who, exactly, had wanted her off that flight, or why she'd spent a career being a name on lists she never got to see either. And she'd learned long ago that some doors close on their own once enough light gets let into the room. She'd lived through things far heavier than a stranger's cruelty. At 30,000 feet, skies on fire, decisions no one should ever have to make alone. The particular silence of a debrief room after a mission where not everyone came home the way you'd planned. This was just noise. She'd learned a long time ago how to let noise pass through her without leaving a mark. She and Julian walked out through the Richmond terminal together that evening, her father's hospital 30 minutes away and waiting, the old flight helmet tucked under her husband's arm, the city opening up warm and unhurried ahead of them. She had never once, in that entire flight, needed anyone's permission to know exactly who she was. The world had simply taken its time catching up.